What's up? Welcome back to another episode of the Art of Advocacy. I'm your host, Dr. Sheldon L. Eakins. I'm also the host of the Leading Equity Podcast. Thank you for joining us. If this is your first time, if you're not already subscribed, first of all, the first question is, if you're not subscribed, why are you not subscribed to the show? You should be. Make sure you follow the channel. Appreciate your support. Help a brother out. Appreciate it. Also, the show is sponsored by Leading Equity, becoming an advocate for all students, not just one, not two, not just the popular kids, but becoming an advocate for all students. If you haven't gotten your copy already, make sure you grab a copy. Again, support your boy. I appreciate it. It means a lot. Today's episode is going to be pretty fun. We're going to be talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging. We're going to talk about all of that today. Very special guest, Jeri Perkins, is here with us. Matter of fact, let me read her bio real quick. Let me read this real quick. Okay. Now, this is in the first person. Okay, so it says, "My name is Jeri C. Perkins, MSW. I am a recent Master of Social Work Policy Administration Community Practice graduate from Arizona State University's Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions." All right, now I'm going to bring her on in just a moment. She can share a little bit more about herself and what she currently does. So, matter of fact, let's do that right now. Without further ado, let me get it all lined up here. We're gonna bring her on right now. I love the hand claps. The hand claps to me is like the icing on the cake. How's it going, Jeri?
Good. How are you?
Listen, I can't complain. It is a Thursday evening. It is live stream evening. This is that time. And I'm excited for this opportunity to chop it up with you. Now, I read your bio. I only read like the first sentence or two because I want to give the opportunity to the guests to really get their opportunity to shine. So I'd love before we get into today's conversation, I'd love for you to share a little bit about yourself and what you currently do.
Yeah, so I am the CEO and founder of Impact Action Network Advocacy Consulting Agency, where we educate to liberate by making diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice a priority and not a checkbox. That's our mission, and our vision is for Black, African, Native, Indigenous, Hispanic, Latino, Latina, and Asian Pacific Islander communities to thrive in every facet of life.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you're here. Now, before we started hitting record, while we were kind of waiting for us to go live, you were mentioning that you had a few speaking engagements coming up. I'd love for you to share a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so I will be speaking at Attitude Mental Health Summit for African American women on the intersectionality of historical and generational trauma in January of 2023. So that's coming up. And I will also be speaking at the World Youth Education Project's Urban Experience, or the Youth World Education Project's Urban Experience Conference in February of 2023 on the intersectionality of historical and generational trauma.
Now, where are these going to be located at?
So these will both be in the Phoenix metro area at University of Phoenix.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited for that. And so folks that are in that area, hopefully they can sign up and get an opportunity to see you live and speak on those two topics. Now, you did mention about the Impact Action Network. Can I ask, can you give us a little background or history behind the founding? What led you to creating this work that you're doing?
Yeah, so while I was at ASU, I served as an inclusive design for Equity and Access Junior Scholar, and I worked on Heritage Month programming for the different Heritage Months, as well as our Watts Day of Learning initiative. We had a AZ Watts Influencers Heritage Month podcast on Podbean, where we would highlight our influencers from the different heritage communities. And during this time, I really developed a passion for advocacy and a passion for providing educational advocacy resources to raise awareness and just highlight the achievements that our communities of color are making. And that really birthed Impact Action Network as a Black woman, I love my community and I want to serve my community and use my access to higher education and my platform to provide those resources. But I recognize the fatigue that each community of color is experiencing uniquely.
Mm.
So, just growing up in diverse environments really birthed my passion to want to utilize Impact Action Network as a resource for all communities of color and allies coming together in unity.
I love it. Okay, well, let's get into today's topic because we're going to be talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice and belonging. But we want to go beyond the check boxes.
Mhm.
Often, I mean, and especially with the work that I do, sometimes I've literally have had educators or I've had principals tell me, "What do I need? Give me the rundown. Give me the check box." And the thing I always say that I say, "Listen, this ain't baking a cake.
Mhm.
You go to the freaking you need your butter, your eggs, and whatever comes. I don't know what comes into a cake, right? But whatever the ingredients are, you don't go to the your local grocery store and you're gonna grab all those items, mix it all up, and boom, now you got a cake within an hour. This is equity work. It don't work that way. So I'm curious on your end with your experience. What are some of the things that you're seeing when you're working with administration? What are some of the trends? Because I see a lot of folks are starting to come on board nowadays when it comes to this work, even with all the pushback that we have on the political side of things. But we see a lot of administrators are recognizing the importance and value of DEIJB. What are some of the things you're seeing?
So I would definitely say that performative allyship versus genuine allyship or themes. Now, as South African anti apartheid human rights activist Desmond Tutu once said, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. So when I'm engaging in DEIBJ work, I definitely see a lot of things in terms of use of language in higher education, mission statements and charters emphasizing inclusion and not exclusion. But when you get into the classroom, the curriculum, in the literature, the curriculum delivery, oftentimes it lacks representation from scholars of color. And oftentimes, these scholars who are mentoring students of color and working on research, working on becoming tenure, and doing all these different things, they're not in the classroom. And, I asked one time, like, where are all the scholars of color? Like, they do exist within the school, but why aren't they in the classroom teaching? Where's the representation in the literature? And oftentimes it's tenure protects scholars. And if they're not tenured, they may not, be in the classroom. And that's to the detriment of our students of color and our white counterparts to not learn from the lived and shared experiences of these scholars who have a different lens, a different approach, and a different perspective. So oftentimes in this work, I see, when white or Caucasian scholars are leading DEIBJ initiatives, culture is represented as a deficit and not a strength. And as
Oh,
we know, a big part of social work practice is culture as a strength and not a deficit. So it's just sometimes you'll see communities of color being problematized instead of addressing the root of pervasive systemic issues rooted in systemic and institutional racism, oppression, and unfair structural conditions that create accumulated challenges and barriers for communities of color. We have, you know, communities of color being the scapegoat or problematized for the oppression that they've historically experienced. And oftentimes also a lot of catering to the fragility of whiteness. Again, at the detriment of our scholars and students of color, normalizing racism and oppression. And a lot of, white Caucasian scholars acknowledging their privilege, acknowledging how they have to use their privilege to discuss these topics and being people are more comfortable, with them discussing these topics. But it lacks the lived and shared experience. It lacks representation, and that's very problematic.
I had a guest on my on the leading equity podcast, and he mentioned the importance of bringing in anti-racist work
Mhm.
in regards to he's like, I don't do DEI work. Essentially what he said is like, I don't do DEI work because he feels like, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't want to misquote him, but he basically said he felt like the DEI work is often the safe route. That's more the acceptable route, but it doesn't specifically address anti-racist or anti-bias practices. And so he's very specific and very intentional with the work that he does. So just kind of hearing what you're saying, because with the work that I do, I'll tell folks, I say, listen, when we talk about culture, a lot of folks automatically default to race, and they forget that culture is like, we all have culture. Because I'll have white people that'll tell me, oh, I don't have any culture, I'm white. I say, no, you have culture. We all do. But we can go beyond that as well. And we also need to recognize that race also is not necessarily the default conversation that we need to have. There's something that you mentioned that I wanted to see if you can expand upon it a little bit more. And I wrote it down. And you said culture. There's a lot of white scholars that say culture or utilize culture as a deficit and not as a strength. Could you dig into that a little bit more for me?
So if you look at um, just in terms of the um, disparities
Mhm.
that are addressed, oftentimes disparities are addressed, like I mentioned, from a just a deficits
Yeah.
mentality. Like, why are the disparities? Why are there disparities in our communities of color? It is not because we are inherently less intelligent or we lack in any area. It is rooted in systemic and institutional racism and oppression.
Mhm.
So instead of looking at mental health from a lens, or for example, one of my research areas of interest is healthcare equity in native communities. Native communities have the highest suicide rate, high alcohol and substance abuse rates. um, it just there these disparities that exist, and in classroom environments oftentimes white scholars may say you list the disparities without going into the historical and generational trauma. Why do they have the highest suicide rates? Why is substance abuse so high? Are they provided with the resources needed? Reservations, no running water, no broadband internet or unstable broadband internet. Natives receive free healthcare through the Indian health system, the IHS, but it's not equitable. So if you look at all these accumulated challenges, perhaps in a solution focused way, if you eliminate the stigma, eliminate the bias and the judgment when Native communities are accessing healthcare through the IHS, if it's culturally acceptable and accessible, perhaps there will be a desire to access culturally competent healthcare. And that these rates, these disparities, even in health, in terms of liver, diabetes, all these rates that are so high, why
Mhm.
are they high? What is the mainstream medical model not addressing to where these rates are high? It's not the people, it's the system. But people work within systems. So tapping into the hearts and minds of the people within the system.
Hey, listen, Jeri. You slow down the preacher because you're bringing the fire today. Hold on, now you got me fired up because here's the thing. All right, so I worked on a reservation out here locally for several years, and I can't tell you how many times I've had professors reach out to me from the local university because they know I work on a reservation. They always want to do all this research.
Mhm.
Oh, can you connect me with the tribes so that I got this new research on diabetes, or I got this research on alcohol, and I'm like, no, I'm not going to connect you. Reason why I don't want to connect you is because I don't want to further perpetuate those quote unquote bad stats, because often those statistics that you're going to just research that you're going to do is not going to share the whole side of the story. Right?
Yeah.
You're not indigenous. You don't have that background. You've never even probably been on a reservation for real. And you're literally reaching out to me because you're afraid to develop that connection on your own. And so now you want to do this research. I have I know the folks out there. And so you want to utilize me and who I know, but I'm not going to put my name out there so that you can exploit this group of people and get those bad stats, and so you can publish another article. You can develop on your tenure, as you mentioned, Jeri.
Mhm.
You can help with your tenure. I don't do it. It just doesn't make any sense why it. Man, we could talk about this all day. You're gonna get me, Jeri, but I appreciate you bringing that up because that happens a lot. Where these statistics, but it doesn't tell the whole story, Jeri.
And re-traumatizes the communities.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we look not just the Native community, but across the board
Yeah.
within our Black community with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment,
Mm.
the sterilization of Black women and girls, Black women being used as experiment during enslavement um, for mainstream the medical model. Henrietta Lacks, her
Mm-hmm.
cells were utilized.
Mm-hmm.
Her family never received compensation, and her cells were utilized for the creation of frameworks and modalities within medicine that is used today.
They still, yeah, I'm about to say they still utilize her cells, right?
All over the world, her cells have been utilized, and the family has not received compensation. And we can go on and on about the wealth gap and how
Mhm.
that plays into it. Generations of wealth being stripped from our Black community through the institution of enslavement, and we
Mhm.
haven't received any reparations because America doesn't care enough about Black folks to provide reparations.
Speaking of, right, let's talk about Black folks for a moment. Because I was just on a podcast interview maybe a month or so ago, and the question came up. Well, it looks like we just got the results from our state testing, and it looks like your kids of color, specifically your Black kids, are doing less or aren't doing as well as your Asian and white students. What are your thoughts, Sheldon? And I said, listen, I'm not here to entertain that. Because again, you're not telling the whole side of the story. When we look at the statistics, when we look at where a lot, let's keep it real. Our schools still segregated. 2022, our schools are still segregated. Even though Brown versus Board of Education was 60 years ago or whatever, and it's supposed to end all the segregation and all, we know that there's been ways to get around that. And our schools are still segregated to this day. Let's have a conversation around the opportunity. You know, we know that there's schools that are highly likely to have highly qualified teachers, have all the technology, have all the resources, have everything, all the bells and whistles that are necessary in order for kids to thrive. And those tend to be those suburban schools, those predominantly white schools. We don't have that conversation. So don't just start with the test scores and tell me, oh, well, what are your thoughts, Sheldon? You're a person of color. What do you think about, Black and brown kids aren't doing as well as white students and then Asian students? What does that mean? And I said, well, you got to tell those story. There's more to it than that because a lot of those kids aren't getting the same. They don't have the advanced placement opportunities, or dual credits, or international baccalaureate opportunities. They don't have the tutoring service, the after school program. They don't have all of those same things that these schools that you're comparing to have. Let's talk about that as opposed to tell me about, well, why the test score is lower than that. Because I do not want to have a full conversation on a deficit mindset, and especially against my people. I'm not going to put that my voice out there for your little podcast. I'm not doing that.
And re-traumatizing for yourself as a scholar of color and re-traumatizing for your community. And that's another problem. To just oftentimes it's all word Black folks are just poor, needy, and oppressed. And the
Mhm.
reality is that that's not representative of our lived and shared experiences as a whole. Just assuming because you're a Black scholar that you can relate with
Yeah.
a community that's underrepresented or underprivileged or underfunded. Oftentimes we've grown up in predominantly white spaces. I know I have, and I mean, I'm not sure what your background is, but it's because we've grown up in these spaces that we have a different worldview and we can see things from a different lens. That we've seen the access to resource we've had, and knowing that every community or every person that looks like us has not had the same access to
Mhm.
opportunity. And
Yeah.
people don't want to talk about that and how resources are not allocated fairly.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I've had the pleasure throughout my K-12 experience. I've had a nice mixture of I've gone to suburban schools, I've gone to charter schools, I've gone to boarding schools. I've had a lot of experiences in education, and then even in my professional career, like as a teacher, I've worked in a lot of different settings. So I've seen a lot, and one thing that I have noticed, and one thing that I would say is, like you said, the experiences of an individual in one neighborhood, racial or not, it's not going to be the exact same experience of another student in another neighborhood state. Like a kid in Chicago, south side of Chicago, growing up in Oakland, or growing up in Houston, growing up in Idaho, it's not going to be the same experience. So we have to keep in mind, what type of resources did they have access to? Statistically, we know that. Think about it. I mean, I was a teacher, and I'll keep it real. I'll be honest. Often, initially, I kind of wanted to kind of work at schools that maybe paid a little bit more. Maybe I wanted to work at a school that did have a little bit more resources for me. Versus, do I want to make the decision of, do I want to work at a school, not necessarily for the money or not necessarily for whatever it is, but I also had to consider, how am I going to feel connected, or how do I want to connect to the community? Now, again, I worked on a reservation out here, and I love the community that I served. It's not necessarily about anything monetarily, wasn't important. It was really, I mean, honestly, I got treated better out there than I got treated in town. And so for me, it was more of the family environment, more of the experiences that I had, and just the connection that I was making with the students. And I really felt comfortable. I mean, they embraced me, and it just, I would even add to that, it made me want to trace my own ancestry, because I mean, the whole community, they're very proud of their tribe. And I was like, well, what tribe am I from? At some point, my ancestry, my folks got here.
Okay.
And it made me, motivated me to do my own ancestry, because I was like, yo, these folks are very proud of who they are and their culture and their just everything. I don't know my background. I want to be able to share this with my students as well. So I mean, to me, that's priceless. You can't put a price tag on, like, there's not a salary requirement for these type of experiences that I've had in certain communities. You just can't, you can't pay for it. And so I'm with you on that one. Thank you so much for bringing these things up.
Thank you.
Let's do this. We've kind of mentioned some challenges, but I want to circle back to when we're doing DEI JB work. And first of all, let me ask this: some people just, a lot of times the conversation we have is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why do you think the JB should be included in that acronym when we're having these conversations?
If we're thinking about DEI work, oftentimes the motivation is revenue, capital, and organizations wanting to engage in this work to increase the bottom line. But really, it should be fostering belonging, and it's a sense of justice. If we look at the reason why we have DEI work, it's because of the historical and generational oppression that the communities of color have experienced as a reason why we need to even do this work in the first place, so that these communities in the workforce and in our world find a sense of belonging amongst their colleagues. That's what justice is. That this world, as you mentioned, tracing your lineage, our ancestors built this country. So, how can our ancestors have built this country, but we are treated like second class citizens? And
Mm.
I often say, and I know this is going off your question a little, but I say, in terms of African American, I don't consider myself African or American, because my ancestors were taken, kidnapped from our ancestral homelands and brought to America, forced to assimilate into a culture that was not our own. So we're not American either. So when you say lineage, like truly, as Black folks in this country, who are we? And how is DEIBJ work trying to just give us a sense of justice and belonging, that this is our home too. We were born here, whether we like it or not, you know.
So how do you identify as? Because I know some folks identify in different ways. If you don't identify as African American,
I mean, for the sake of I identify as a black woman, but
Mhm.
then again, that's in proximity to whiteness. That's why is there black? Why is there white? Why is there all the? It's about proximity to whiteness. It's all these identifiers are creating division between our communities. So I'm proud to, in terms of African American culture, like I'm proud to say, to check the box that I'm African American because it's about culture, it's about tradition, it's about our ancestors, paving the way for us in this country and for us to be able to even say we are American because of their sacrifices. And we are African because of their lineage. But I feel like African American to me is subscribing in identity to people in proximity to whiteness
Mm.
or just subscription. I feel like every community should have the ability to subscribe their own identity to themselves because as we know, our roots trace back literally over the world, from Africa to Europe to everywhere else. It's a matter of we just we we we've had an identity subscribed to us. It's time for us to subscribe an identity to ourselves.
Okay, okay, I'm with you on that. I typically, when people ask me, I normally just say I'm black.
Mm,
Um, and that's often not necessarily on my applications and forms. You usually see the African American option, but I always, my thing is, not everybody that's black identifies as African American. You got your Caribbean folks, you
mhm,
got your folks from different areas, and they
mhm,
might describe themselves. So I always say that to me the safest way is just to say that you're black.
mhm,
Um, because and if someone thinks otherwise, they can correct you. I would just say it confidently. I see a lot of my white colleagues will struggle to say the word black because they don't want to be accused of being racist or whatever. I'm like, you're not saying anything like racist if you're
mhm,
just describing someone or just identifying someone. The
mhm.
challenge is when we start utilizing racial terms or race in a negative light, then obviously that's a different conversation. So, um, let me ask you: if I reached out to you as an administrator, and let's say, hey, Jeri, I want a consultation. I have some challenges at my school. Where's typically how does those conversations typically, like, how do you lead those kind of discussions, those kind of consultations?
Yeah, so I have a free 30-minute consultation to meet with prospective clients to see if we are a good fit
Mhm.
and to kind of do a needs assessment in terms of how would I come in as an advocacy consultant to bridge the gap between the system in which the client is, navigating and their role within the institution and the communities that they are serving. So being able to kind of assess and evaluate evidence-based practices that are culturally relevant to the communities or to the families and the students that the administrator is working with, and how I can come in and use tailored frameworks to meet that community where they're at, to meet their individualized needs, whether that be educational advocacy resources in terms of coming in to speak and or coming in to do trainings or courses, classes, and raise awareness how culture should be represented as a strength, and that resiliency is the greatest protective factor that our ancestor gave us. It just could range based on the administrator and the background they have and the needs.
Do you So I do a lot of keynotes, and often when I do keynotes, I always ask, can I do a workshop in addition to the keynote? Just because I mean, I can get folks hyped up. I mean, I can go up there and tell a bunch of jokes and give them a nice, powerful message. But I also want to feel like I'm making an impact as well in the classroom or maybe in the leadership. So do you often, or do you kind of promote, multiple services? Not just a one time I show up and do a 90 minutes or 60 minutes something with somebody, but are you looking at doing more continual work with certain groups?
Absolutely. That's the goal, to have communities that are in need of these educational advocacy resources, and that, just as you said, I'm able to do workshops. I'm able to repackage my ideologies that I'm
Mhm.
speaking about and raising awareness about so that the community feels like they have the knowledge and to act to self advocate for themselves, and that they've received that increase in knowledge based and awareness from whatever services that are provided, whether that be on a micro, one-on-one level, or a macro, community or systems level. So that's the goal. Like with the clients that I'm working with right now, like I was working with Dr. Jessica Peterkin at Brayton Family Dental on her Teeth and Tatas and Ministry of Dentistry nonprofit initiatives, the Black Motherhood Initiative for mothers to be able to feed their children naturally and nourish their children naturally. And, I started off with a resource guide, and I'm still, partnering. It's whenever they're ready to pick up the initiative, like I'm here. What can we do in the meantime to keep raising this awareness? And then I have another client that I work with, a Rock Foundation Boxing in South Phoenix. They work with Black and Hispanic youth and just ACEs, doing classes on ACEs. And I actually haven't started doing this yet, but the owner, Mr. Barnes, he has Surviving the Stop classes where he educates our Black and Brown communities on the rights that they need to know in order to not just not be implicated when they're stopped and be charged for something that they shouldn't have been charged with in the beginning, but
Mhm.
so that they don't lose their life to senseless acts of violence, And he does that, and it's ongoing, and that's partnering with people within the community who have the lived and shared experiences and can relate to the community. I believe in building relationships and community stakeholder engagement, and that's a everyday thing.
Now you mentioned ACEs, adverse childhood experiences,
Mhm.
and I know that relates to have was this like 10 different questions or something like
Yeah.
that. It kind of gives you your score, and so as a result, I know you do a lot of work on the relation. I believe the relationship between ACEs and also childhood, or sorry, trauma. Tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about that. How you got into that work.
So intersectionality of identity was one of my favorite theories, intersectionality theory in school. So I remember just my first year of grad school and writing a paper about who am I and
Mhm.
thinking about the intersectionality of my identity as a Black woman. That I've experienced different levels of privilege, but I've also experienced different levels of oppression. And I just started to really think in terms of childhood trauma, and I spoke at the statewide childhood abuse prevention conference on ACEs and the intersectionality of childhood trauma. Because as we know from a historical and generational lens, each community has dealt with different levels of trauma and oppression. And you have to put those factors into your work with ACEs, because it's a matter of not just, okay, sure. And again, it's the deficit mentality. If ACEs scores are high, why are they high? What historical or generational trauma? How is that playing a role? Person and environment theory, which says that a person's environment influences their life choices and decisions and behaviors and subsequent life path and life trajectory. And that these are things that oftentimes as children transition from adolescence to adulthood, these are all factors in ACEs scores. So seeing the intersectionality of childhood trauma, race, ethnicity, gender orientation, gender identity, sexual orientation, culture, background, socioeconomic status, really, like you mentioned earlier, tells the story of ACEs scores and not just putting a number on a child based on their experiences, but holistically assessing and evaluating from the lens of their life experience.
So that's going beyond just okay, this score, this child has this score on their ACEs, but learning a little bit more, or maybe considering okay, why this child might be acting a certain way in class because of those traumas. Is that kind of what you mean?
Absolutely. Because it's not that these children, no child is bad. All children are their children, and
Hmm.
trauma oftentimes influences behavior and actions and the different, and all these different disorders that, put in labels on children. It's important to know what a child is challenged by, the different things they're living with, because you want to enhance that child's quality of life.
Mhm.
But don't put a label on that child in terms of a learning disability or a behavioral issue that, and oftentimes that criminalizes children. You look at the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah.
These children got a rap sheet from kindergarten to middle school to high school if they make it before, in that breaking that. That's what that is about.
It now I hear the argument. Well, we need to know this information. It's pertinent information because we want to protect our, maybe our staff. We want to protect our the child and all those kind of things. Now, and as a special ed person, I'm a person who does believe strongly in like IEPs,
Yeah.
504 plans. Um, but just what I would often see is a lot of my students that would come in, or students that had IEPs that were in our program, were often, in my opinion, in my expert opinion, if you will,
Mhm.
misdiagnosed.
Oh,
I,
really?
I found a lot of my students. I was like, you don't have a learning disability. You don't have anything impeding on your progress or ability to learn, or you're not ADHD. You don't have, I don't think you're defiant and none of these things. Just to me, just because you're a teacher that can't seem to figure out the relationship dynamic between a student, and then they're quickly to refer them to services, that's where I struggle with that. And I'm like, y'all need to start thinking about your biases that you might have. You're not going to get along. You may not get along with every single student in your vicinity. And that one or two students that you feel like I can't figure out how to connect with them for whatever reason, this student is being labeled as a troublemaker and bad and all these things. And they get referred and they get services. And I've seen sometimes some of these services, the psychologists don't do enough background knowledge or really meeting with the parents or guardians, taking the time to get learn the history. But they just test them.
Mhm.
They just do the test. Oh, well, you scored at such and such, baseline, the national scale. This is where you rank. And so therefore you have this learning disability. And I found like that's causes a lot of kids to be misdiagnosed.
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
yeah, and that's the problem. Dr. Cheryl Wright is here. Good to see you. Thought provoking. Thank you so much for your message there. Um, you know, when I was working with my school psychologist at the school on the reservation, and we had a conversation because I told him, I said, I would really want to make sure that our students are being assessed properly. And I'm very thankful for the school psychologist that I had that I was working with, and even our a professor was working with him as well, from special ed. And what they did was when they would do their testing, and they definitely did a great job with finding out the background, meeting with the guardian, talking to them about the child, talking to the child, getting to know the child, um not just testing them, but then also what they were doing was when they would do the test, they wouldn't necessarily do the test to rank against on a national scale, but they would test the kids according to the other students in the school, and not necessarily as a on a national. And I saw that to me made a lot more sense, because when we think about all the students and those who take these tests on a national scale, it's going to skew. I think it's going to skew the results, and you have to really think about the geographics, again, the resources and all those things that are available in your school. There's this child is going to be at my school. It makes more sense to see where they fit in line with the other students, with their peers, as opposed to students that they have no relation to. So, um, thank you so much for you have been I will say this, Jerry. You've been bringing the fire. And
Mhm.
so, for those who are looking to, especially if you're in do you work primarily in the Arizona area, or I mean, where do you typically
But
do
I'm
your
willing
services?
to travel. I am willing to travel. Mhm.
Okay, okay, she's willing to travel. Um, is there anything that we have not discussed that you wanted to bring up in this conversation today?
Um, I would definitely say when it comes to DEI work, for people to really to tap into the hearts and minds of people and to ask themselves if there is a pushback when it comes to integrating and embedding DEIBJ into the mission and vision and core values and principles of an organization, to assess and evaluate how is the identity or the structure on which that organization has been built threatened by the integration of these principles? Or how is identity of individuals threatened by the integration of DEI? Because something that I'm really seeing in my work is that it's all about what white folks are comfortable with. We go as far, the needle is pushed as far as they're comfortable. And we're constantly, it's until we get to the point where people are able to evaluate their identity and dismantle the systems and institutions that uphold their supremacy. Diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice will not be a priority. It will continue to be a checkbox. So I challenge my white allies and colleagues to answer that call to action. And I also challenge my colleagues of color to, for us all to have social empathy for one another's lived and shared experiences and how we may be experiencing fatigue, to know that, one of my colleagues said, it's hard being an ally, it's hard. And I said, yeah, I bet it is, and it's hard experiencing racism and oppression, but like, how can we have empathy for one another?
Yeah, I
That's
always say it's supposed to be hard.
yeah.
You're not doing something right because, like you said, there's pushback, right? And I think I agree with you. You know, a lot of the pushback is fragility. When we look at all the the books that have been banned, and the reasons why the books are banned, they're often banned because they either highlight racial or systemic racial challenges that are out there. Um, it might also highlight issues with, especially with like our LGBTQ plus. So there's a lot of morality, Christian principles, and those kind of influences that are part of these books that are being banned, or even content that is being banned. I mean, they people want to push, oh, stick to just the math, stick to just science, stick to just English. The kids don't need to learn about other stuff, but you forget that they're human beings. And as human beings, we have like emotions. We have things that trigger us. Like you said, we have aces. We have there's trauma. There's different things that bring us that's part of who we are. And so if a child is having some issues at home, maybe they're having some issues on a bullying, or maybe some COVID stuff, or whatever it is, and then we expect them to do well on a test, or do well on a quiz, or get their homework in and do assignments, or whatever it is, but we're not considering what is the other issues or challenges that a student is experiencing as a human being, that we as adults often struggle with. So imagine what an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old is dealing with, that they're so I agree. I mean, we have to consider the whole child and can't just consider just the academic side. And I think that's part of that conversation regarding the pushback that's out there. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Absolutely. And um, I appreciate your work as a scholar of color, as a Black scholar, Dr. Eakins
Aiken.
and Akins.
Mhm.
And I just want to also just express that appreciation to all the scholars of color who have taken on that tax, that invisible tax, and that
Mhm.
fatigue of mentoring students of color through systems of higher education and institutions of academia. Because I myself, without the grace of God and my scholars of color, my female Black mentors, and I wouldn't be Jeri Perkins MSW today, because I'm telling you, the system by design is built for us not to make it. And it's because of the sacrifice of scholars of color, that yourself, because of the sacrifices of our ancestors, that we are here doing the work we are doing, providing that representation and access for future generations. That is so powerful. So much appreciation to all those who paved the way for the work that we are doing, and the future generations that we are paving the way for. We are our ancestors' wildest dreams.
Hey, all right. I like that. We're gonna end it right there. So, Jerry, Jerry, if we got some folks that want to connect with you, they want to get in touch and find out more about you and your services, what's the best way to reach you online?
Yeah, you can email me at impactactionnetwork@gmail.com. You can visit my website, www impactactionnetwork.com. Connect with me on Instagram, at impact_action_network, and Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Impact Action Network Advocacy Consulting Agency.
You have a YouTube channel as well?
Yes, I do. I don't have anything on there yet, but if you want to see my earlier works from my talk show, Impact of Jeri Perkins on JCTV Access during my days at Lincoln University, Missouri, um, yeah, I'd be happy to share that information. That's really what got me started doing this work.
There we go. We all have an origin story. And so, yeah, folks, the website is down there at the bottom of the screen, impactactionnetwork.com. Make sure you check Jeri's work out. If you're in the Phoenix area next month in February, there's some speaking engagements for her as well. Jeri, it has truly been a pleasure. I appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Eakins. And I would just like to end with a quote, if I may,
Yeah,
by
absolutely.
Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey once said, "A people without knowledge of their past, history, culture, and origin is like a tree without roots."
Mm, mm, mm. Every time I think we had already had a mic drop, you come back with another one. So thank you again. It's truly been a pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Take care.
You too.
All right, folks. Another episode of not the Leading Equity Podcast. The Art of Advocacy. Another episode in the books. That was my special guest, Jeri Perkins. Look, one of my takeaways, I always like to try to say what are some of my takeaways from the show. In this conversation, I think what really stood out to me, and this was the part that I kind of wrote down, the first thing that I wrote down was there's a lot of scholars out there that will utilize culture as a deficit. And I see this a lot. I see it a lot here in Idaho, especially when our students where English is not their first language. And so they get mistreated or treated as less than or less intelligent because English is not their first language. Not that there's anything wrong with them. They don't have a learning disability, and they don't think it's just because, only in the United States, we look down on people that speak multiple languages if English is not their first. I wish I spoke more than just English. That's all I got. That's all I got for you. For some reason, because of that, that's considered privilege. It's crazy. That's the whole conversation there. But it really was a good conversation today with Jeri. Again, her information is scrolling down at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to get in touch and check out the work that she's doing as well. Remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But by all means, keep moving. Let's continue to be a voice in leading equity.